Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, I'd like to invite you to travel back through time to a quiet winter evening in Colonial Boston. Long before the city was filled with busy streets, towering buildings, and the constant rhythm of modern life, Boston was a much smaller place. It was a town of narrow winding lanes, weathered wooden homes, church steeples rising above the rooftops, and a harbor that served as the heart of everyday life. As the sun slips below the horizon, lanterns begin to glow in the windows. The smell of salt water drifts inland on a cold December breeze. Ships gently rock against their moorings, their wooden hulls creaking softly with each movement of the tide. Somewhere nearby, a horse slowly pulls a cart over uneven cobblestones. A church bell rings in the distance before the town settles into another peaceful evening. This is Boston in the year 1773. It is a place that, at first glance, seems rather ordinary. Merchants close their shops for the night. Families gather around fireplaces to escape the chill of early winter. Sailors finish unloading cargo from ships that have crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Children hurry home before darkness fully settles over the town. Yet beneath this calm and familiar routine, something extraordinary is quietly unfolding. Most people have heard of the Boston Tea Party. It is one of the most famous moments in American history, often remembered as a bold protest in which colonists boarded ships and threw hundreds of chests of tea into Boston harbor. The image has appeared in countless paintings, history books, and classrooms for generations. But as with many famous stories, the real history is much richer and much quieter than the legends that grew around it. The Boston Tea Party was not a sudden burst of anger. It was not planned in a single afternoon, nor was it simply about tea. Instead, it was the result of years of changing relationships, distant political decisions, everyday frustrations, and ordinary people trying to understand their place within a vast empire that stretched across oceans. Tonight, rather than rushing toward that famous December night, we'll take our time. We'll wander through the streets of colonial Boston at an unhurried pace. We'll visit busy docks where merchant ships arrived from across the Atlantic carrying everything from molasses and rum to fine fabrics, spices, and tea. We'll step inside cozy homes where candles flicker beside warm hearths and simple cups of tea are shared among family and friends. Along the way, we'll meet merchants, apprentices, ship captains, printers, craftsmen, and governors. We'll learn about the British Empire at the height of its power, and discover how a small town on the edge of North America became the center of an event that would echo throughout history. We'll explore how tea traveled thousands of miles from the mountains of China to the breakfast tables of England and the American colonies. We'll see why a simple drink became one of the world's most valuable commodities, and how a struggling trading company unexpectedly found itself at the center of an international political crisis. We'll also discover that history is rarely made in dramatic moments alone. Far more often, it is shaped by countless quiet decisions. A law passed in a distant parliament. A newspaper article read over breakfast. A conversation in a crowded tavern. A ship delayed by weather. A merchant worried about his livelihood. A governor refusing to compromise. Each small event, almost unnoticed at the time, gradually built upon the last until one chilly December evening changed the course of history. As we journey through these events together, there is no need to hurry. This is not a tale of constant battles or dramatic speeches. Instead, we'll let the story unfold slowly, much as it did for the people who lived it. Take a moment to imagine yourself standing on Boston's waterfront. The harbor stretches out before you, its dark waters reflecting the soft glow of moonlight. Tall-masted sailing ships sway gently with the tide, their ropes humming quietly in the wind. The scent of pine tar, damp wood, and sea salt fills the cool evening air. Somewhere nearby, waves softly lap against the wooden pilings of Griffin's Wharf. If you listen carefully, You might hear sailors calling to one another aboard distant ships. Perhaps a gull cries overhead before settling for the night. Somewhere behind you, a tavern door opens briefly, allowing laughter and warm candlelight to spill into the cold street before closing once again. The world feels peaceful. It is difficult to imagine that within only a few weeks, these same quiet docks will become the setting for one of history's most remembered acts of protest. Yet even then, the night itself would be surprisingly orderly. There would be no wild celebration, no raging battle, and very little shouting. Instead, hundreds of determined men would work carefully and methodically under the pale light of a December moon, carrying out a task they believed was necessary. By morning, nearly 350 chests of tea would rest beneath the cold waters of Boston Harbor. The ripples from that single evening would travel much farther than anyone present could have imagined. So, find a comfortable place to rest. Allow the worries of today to slowly drift away, like ships disappearing beyond the horizon. As the harbor grows quiet and the lanterns flicker softly against the winter darkness, let's journey together into the gentle, fascinating history of the Boston Tea Party, and discover how one peaceful harbor became the setting for an event that helped shape the future of a nation. Long before the sound of marching soldiers filled its streets, before angry crowds gathered beneath the glow of lanterns, and before a quiet harbor became the setting for one of the most famous acts of protest in history, Boston was simply a small colonial city resting beside the sea. In the early years of the 18th century, Boston was a place shaped by water. The harbor was the city's heartbeat, stretching outward with countless small islands, rocky shores, and busy docks where ships arrived from distant corners of the world. The tides moved slowly in and out, carrying vessels loaded with goods, messages, and stories from across the Atlantic Ocean. At sunrise, the city would begin to stir. The first sounds were gentle ones, the creaking of wooden ships tied along the wharves, the calls of sailors preparing for the day, the footsteps of merchants walking over uneven streets, and the distant ringing of church bells announcing another morning in Colonial, Massachusetts. Boston was not a large city by modern standards. Its population was only around 16,000 people, making it one of the largest towns in British North America, but still a small community where many residents knew one another. The city was crowded onto a narrow peninsula surrounded by water, with winding streets that followed the shape of the land rather than any carefully planned design. The homes and buildings of Boston reflected the world of the 1700s. Wooden houses stood close together, their walls weathered by salty ocean air and harsh New England winters. Many homes had small gardens, fireplaces for warmth, and simple rooms where families gathered in the evening light. Candles flickered after sunset, casting soft shadows across wooden floors as people finished their daily tasks. Life in colonial Boston followed the rhythm of the seasons. Winters were long and cold. Snow covered the streets, and families gathered around fireplaces to stay warm. The harbor sometimes froze near the shoreline, and the wind from the Atlantic could cut sharply through heavy clothing. Spring brought the return of ships and the beginning of another busy trading season. Summers were filled with activity along the waterfront, while autumn brought harvests, preparations for winter, and the arrival of new goods from overseas. For many people living in Boston, the harbor was more than just a view from their windows. It was their connection to the wider world. Ships carried lumber, fish, salt, molasses, cloth, spices, and countless other goods between Boston and other ports. Merchants carefully tracked shipments arriving from England, the Caribbean, and other parts of the British Empire. Sailors spent months at sea before returning with stories of distant places, unfamiliar cultures, and dangerous storms. The economy of Boston depended heavily on trade. Merchants worked from small offices near the waterfront, negotiating prices and arranging shipments. Craftsmen filled the city's streets with their workshops. Blacksmiths shaped iron over glowing fires. Carpenters built furniture and repaired ships. Printers produced newspapers and pamphlets, and bakers prepared bread for families and sailors alike. The city was filled with people who depended on one another. A ship arriving in the harbor meant work for many. Dock workers unloaded cargo. Shopkeepers stocked their shelves. Carpenters repaired damaged vessels. Sailmakers stitched new sails. Innkeepers welcomed travelers arriving from distant towns. Every part of Boston's daily life was connected to the movement of ships and goods. But Boston was also a city of ideas. Religion, politics, and community discussions played an important role in everyday life. Meeting houses stood as important gathering places where people came together not only for worship, but also to discuss news and events. Taverns served as places where neighbors shared meals, exchanged stories, and debated the issues of the day. In these warm, crowded rooms, lit by candlelight and filled with the smell of wood smoke and fresh food, people talked about everything from the price of goods to decisions made across the ocean in London. At this time, most people in Boston still considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Empire. They spoke of Britain as their homeland and took pride in being part of a powerful global empire. The British flag flew above government buildings, British laws shaped daily life, and British ships protected the colonies from foreign enemies. Yet Boston was also developing its own unique identity. The people who lived there had grown accustomed to managing their own local affairs. Town meetings allowed citizens to discuss important issues. Merchants made their own decisions about trade. Families built lives that were increasingly different from those of people living thousands of miles away in Britain. The Atlantic Ocean connected Boston to Britain, but it also created distance. A message from London could take weeks or even months to arrive. By the time news crossed the ocean, circumstances might have already changed. The people of Boston were beginning to see themselves not only as British citizens living in America, but as members of a distinct colonial society with its own traditions and concerns. Still, in the years before the Revolution, Boston remained a peaceful and familiar place. The city's mornings began with the same routines. Bakers prepared their ovens. Merchants opened their shops. Fishermen headed out into the harbor. Families went about their daily lives. Children played in the streets while adults worked nearby. No one walking along the waterfront in those quiet years could have known what the future held. The same harbor that brought prosperity would one day become the stage for an act of defiance. The same streets where merchants carried their goods would later echo with protests and arguments about liberty. The same meeting houses where neighbors gathered for ordinary discussions would become places where the future of a nation was debated. But for now, Boston was simply a colonial port city beside the sea. Its ships rested gently against the docks. Its lanterns glowed softly in the evening darkness. Its people lived ordinary lives, unaware that the decisions made in their small city would soon become part of a story remembered around the world. And as the sun set over Boston Harbor, the city settled into another quiet night, waiting for the events that would slowly begin to change everything. In the years before the Boston Tea Party, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was built on a complicated mixture of loyalty, tradition, and growing uncertainty. For much of the 18th century, the people living in Boston and throughout the colonies considered themselves British. They shared a language, a legal system, cultural traditions, and a connection to a powerful empire that stretched across oceans and continents. Many colonists took pride in being part of the British world, believing they were citizens of one of the greatest empires on earth. The British Empire of the 1700s was enormous. Its ships traveled across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, carrying goods, soldiers, and ideas. London was the center of this vast network, where decisions were made that affected people thousands of miles away. Across the Atlantic Ocean, however, the 13 American colonies had developed a life of their own. The colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America, from the rocky shores of New England to the warm fields of the southern colonies. Each region had its own economy, customs, and way of life. Some communities depended on fishing and shipbuilding. Others relied on farming, plantations, and trade. Although Britain controlled the colonies, everyday life was often managed locally. This arrangement had existed for generations. Britain provided protection, especially during times of war, while the colonies supplied resources and trade that strengthened the empire. British merchants benefited from colonial goods, and colonists benefited from access to British markets and military protection. For many years, this relationship worked well. The colonies sent valuable products to Britain, including tobacco, timber, rice, and other materials. In return, British manufactured goods flowed back across the ocean. The people of Boston were especially connected to this Atlantic world. The city's merchants depended on relationships with British ports. Ships arriving from England carried finished products such as cloth, tools, household items, and of course tea. Boston's harbor was a doorway between colonial America and the wider British Empire. But while the colonies benefited from this relationship, they were also separated from Britain by thousands of miles of ocean. The distance created a unique situation. Colonial leaders made decisions in America, while officials in London made decisions for the empire as a whole. Sometimes these decisions matched the interests of the colonies. Other times, they did not. For many years, Britain largely allowed the colonies a significant amount of independence in their daily affairs. This unofficial approach became known as salutary neglect, meaning that Britain often chose not to closely interfere with colonial governments and trade. Because of this, generations of colonists became accustomed to handling their own problems. Their daily concerns were local: the success of their harvest, the arrival of ships, the cost of goods, and the well-being of their families. But the world was changing. By the middle of the 1700s, Britain faced new challenges. Maintaining a global empire required enormous amounts of money. The British military protected its colonies, fought wars against rival nations, and maintained a powerful navy that guarded trade routes across the world. These efforts came at a great cost. British leaders increasingly believed that the colonies should contribute more financially to the empire that protected them. From their perspective, the American colonies had benefited greatly from British military support and should help pay for the expenses of maintaining that protection. Many colonists saw the situation differently. They did not deny their connection to Britain, but they believed that taxes and laws affecting them should be created with their approval. Since the colonies had no elected representatives sitting in the British Parliament, many began questioning whether Britain had the right to impose certain decisions upon them. This disagreement would slowly grow into one of the most important conflicts in modern history. At first, the debate was not about independence. Most colonists did not want to separate from Britain. They wanted to preserve what they believed were their traditional rights as British citizens. They often described themselves as loyal subjects who were defending the freedoms they had inherited. The idea of rights was deeply important in 18th-century British society. Many people believed that citizens were protected by long-standing traditions and legal customs. Among these ideas was the belief that government should not take away a person's property without proper consent. For colonists, taxation became connected to this larger question. If Britain could impose taxes without colonial approval, many wondered, what other powers could it claim in the future? These concerns were especially strong in Boston, where merchants, printers, and community leaders closely followed political debates. The city's busy harbor brought news from across the Atlantic, and newspapers spread information quickly among residents. In taverns and meeting houses, people began discussing questions that had once seemed distant. How much authority should Britain have over the colonies? How much independence should colonial governments have? Could someone be both British and American? These questions did not have simple answers. For years, the colonies and Britain had existed in a comfortable balance. The colonies enjoyed protection and trade opportunities, while Britain benefited from their resources and loyalty. But after decades of relative independence, many colonists had developed expectations about their role in government. The people of Boston still walked through familiar streets. Ships still arrived at the harbor. Merchants still opened their shops each morning. Families still gathered around warm fireplaces at night. The British Empire was trying to strengthen its control over its growing colonies. The colonists were beginning to think more carefully about their rights and their relationship with distant rulers. Neither side knew exactly where these disagreements would lead. But slowly, through a series of decisions, protests, and misunderstandings, a quiet tension began spreading throughout the colonies. And in Boston, the city beside the sea, those tensions would soon become impossible to ignore. Before the Boston Tea Party became a symbol of resistance, before crowds gathered in the streets and ships carried unwanted cargo into Boston Harbor, there was another event that quietly changed the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. This conflict would become known as the French and Indian War. For many people living in the colonies during the mid-1700s, the war was not just something happening far away. It shaped their communities, affected their families, and changed how they viewed the British Empire. It also created financial problems and political disagreements that would eventually lead to the protests surrounding the Boston Tea Party. During the 1700s, North America was a place where several powerful groups competed for influence. Britain and France were the two major European powers fighting for control of trade, territory, and resources. Both nations had established colonies across the continent, and both wanted to expand their influence. The French controlled large areas of Canada and the interior of North America. Their territory stretched through the Great Lakes region and along the Mississippi River. The British colonies, meanwhile, occupied the eastern coastline, where growing communities of farmers, merchants, and settlers continued to expand westward. Between these two empires was a vast landscape of forests, mountains, and rivers. This region was valuable because it contained fertile land and important trade routes. The Ohio River Valley, in particular, became a place of intense competition. Both Britain and France believed they had claims to the area, and both wanted to control the movement of goods and people through this important region. The conflict began in the early 1750s when British colonial forces and French forces clashed in the Ohio Valley. Among the young British officers involved was a Virginia colonist named George Washington, who was sent to help defend British interests in the region. These early battles eventually grew into a much larger conflict that spread beyond North America. In Europe, Britain and France were already rivals. Their struggle for power was not limited to one continent. Soon, the fighting became part of a larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. For the people living in the American colonies, however, it was known simply as the French and Indian War. The name came from the fact that many Native American nations became involved in the conflict, often choosing alliances based on their own interests and relationships with European powers. Some supported the French, while others supported the British. Native communities had their own political goals and concerns. They were not simply participants in a European conflict. They were defending their lands, protecting their trade networks, and making decisions that would affect their own futures. The war lasted for years and placed enormous demands on Britain and its colonies. Thousands of soldiers traveled across the Atlantic. Colonial militias were organized. Towns provided supplies. Families experienced the uncertainty that came with a distant war. Even communities far from the battlefield felt its effects. In New England, many young men joined military campaigns, leaving behind farms, businesses, and families. Ships carried soldiers and supplies through coastal waters. Colonial governments worked with British officials to support the war effort. For much of the conflict, many colonists viewed Britain as an important ally. The British military represented protection against a powerful rival empire. Many colonists believed that defending the empire also meant defending their own homes and communities. However, the war came with a tremendous cost. By the time the fighting ended in 1763, Britain had spent enormous amounts of money. The empire had gained significant territory and emerged victorious over France, but it was also deeply in debt. British leaders faced a difficult question. How should they pay for the costs of maintaining such a large empire? From the perspective of many officials in London, the answer seemed obvious. Since the colonies had benefited from Britain's military protection, they should help contribute to the expenses of that protection. But many colonists disagreed. They believed they had already contributed through supplying troops, materials, and resources during the war. They also believed that decisions about colonial taxes should be made by their own elected representatives. The war had created a new relationship between Britain and the colonies. Before the conflict, many colonists viewed the British Empire as a distant but beneficial presence. After the war, Britain began taking a more direct role in colonial affairs. The relaxed approach of previous decades began to disappear. British officials wanted greater control. Colonists wanted to preserve the freedoms they believed they had always enjoyed. This difference in perspective would become increasingly important in the years ahead. The end of the war also changed the physical landscape of North America. Britain gained control of vast new territories, but the empire faced the challenge of managing and defending those lands. British leaders worried about conflicts with native nations and believed a permanent military presence was necessary. To help pay for these expenses, Britain began looking toward the colonies for additional revenue. This was the beginning of a new era. The same empire that colonists had celebrated for protecting them now began introducing new taxes and regulations. The same government that had once seemed distant now became a source of frustration and debate. In Boston, these changes would be felt deeply. The city's merchants depended on trade. Its citizens valued local decision-making. Its residents were accustomed to discussing politics and defending what they believed were their rights. The war had ended, but another kind of conflict was beginning. It would not be fought at first with armies or cannons. Instead, it would unfold through newspapers, public meetings, petitions, and debates. Slowly, the people of Boston would begin asking a question that would echo throughout the colonies. How much power should a distant government have over people who had no voice in its decisions? The answer to that question would shape the events that followed. And in the years after the French and Indian War, the first signs of change began appearing along the quiet streets and busy harbor of Boston. In the years following the French and Indian War, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies began to change. For generations, the colonies had enjoyed a certain amount of independence. Local governments managed many of their own affairs, merchants carried out trade, and ordinary people rarely felt the influence of decisions made thousands of miles away in London. But after the war ended in 1763, Britain began looking at its empire differently. The war had expanded British control across North America, but victory came with a heavy price. The British government had borrowed enormous amounts of money to fund armies, ships, and supplies. Although Britain had defeated France and become the dominant power in North America, its leaders now faced a growing financial burden. Maintaining an empire was expensive. The British government believed that since the American colonies had benefited from the protection provided during the war, they should help contribute to the costs of maintaining that protection. To many British leaders, this seemed reasonable. The colonies were growing wealthier. Their merchants were benefiting from trade within the British Empire. Their population was increasing. From Britain's perspective, asking the colonies to contribute financially was simply a fair responsibility of being part of the empire. But many colonists saw the issue differently. They did not believe Britain had the right to impose taxes on them without their approval. This disagreement would become one of the most important political debates of the 18th century. The first major step came in 1764 with the passage of the Sugar Act. Despite its name, the Sugar Act was not simply about sugar. It was designed to raise revenue by placing new restrictions and taxes on certain imported goods, especially molasses, which was an important product in colonial trade. Molasses was used to make rum, a major industry in many colonial ports, including Boston. Merchants depended on the importation of molasses from the Caribbean, and any increase in costs affected their businesses. The British government believed the Sugar Act would help solve financial problems while also reducing smuggling. For years, some colonial merchants had avoided certain trade restrictions, and British officials wanted stronger enforcement. To Britain, this was a practical measure. To many colonists, it represented something much larger. The issue was not only the amount of money being collected. It was the idea that a government across the ocean could create taxes affecting their lives without their direct consent. The phrase that would become famous in the years ahead was beginning to take shape. Taxation without representation. At the heart of this argument was a question about rights. Many colonists believed that British citizens had a traditional right to approve taxes through their elected representatives. Since the colonies did not send representatives to Parliament in London, many felt they had no voice in decisions that affected them. British officials disagreed. They argued that Parliament represented the interests of the entire empire, including the colonies. They believed that members of Parliament did not need to be directly elected by every person they represented. This idea became known as virtual representation. To many colonists, however, this explanation was not convincing. They believed representation required an actual voice. They wanted their own elected colonial assemblies to have control over local taxation and government decisions. In Boston, these debates became especially important. The city was filled with merchants, printers, and politically active citizens who followed events closely. News traveled quickly through newspapers, letters, and conversations in taverns. A decision made in London could become the subject of discussion throughout Boston within weeks. Merchants worried about the financial effects of the Sugar Act. Political leaders worried about what it meant for colonial rights. Ordinary citizens began wondering whether Britain might continue creating new laws and taxes without their approval. Resistance began slowly. At first, many colonists did not call for separation from Britain. They still considered themselves loyal British subjects. Their goal was not revolution, but rather the protection of what they believed were their traditional freedoms. Petitions were written. Arguments were made. Public discussions became more common. The colonial response showed that something important was changing. For many years, people in the colonies had accepted British authority because it was familiar and because the empire had provided protection and economic opportunities. But now, as Britain began exercising more direct control, colonists started examining the relationship more carefully. They began asking whether loyalty to Britain and defense of their own rights could exist together. The Sugar Act itself was not enough to create a revolution. It did not immediately cause widespread rebellion. Instead, it became one of the first moments when many colonists openly challenged Britain's authority. It was a small crack in a relationship that had once seemed unbreakable. The disagreement also revealed a growing difference between how Britain and the colonies viewed the empire. British leaders saw the colonies as valuable parts of a larger system that required cooperation and financial support. Many colonists increasingly saw themselves as communities with their own governments, traditions, and interests. Both sides believed they were defending fairness. Both sides believed they were protecting their rights. And neither side fully understood how far this disagreement would eventually go. In Boston, the daily rhythm of life continued. Ships still entered the harbor. Merchants still opened their shops. Families still gathered around fireplaces in the evening. Children still walked through the narrow streets of the city. But conversations had begun to change. Along the waterfront and inside candlelit taverns, people were no longer only discussing trade and weather. They were discussing government, liberty, and the limits of authority. The Sugar Act had introduced a question that would continue growing over the next several years. If a government could tax people who had no voice in that government, where would its power end? That question would soon become even more important when Britain introduced another law that affected nearly every corner of colonial life. And in Boston, resistance was only beginning. In the years after the Sugar Act, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies continued to grow more complicated. The disagreement over taxation had introduced a new question into colonial life. Did Britain have the authority to create laws and collect taxes from people who had no elected representatives in Parliament? For many colonists, this question was no longer just about money. It was about the meaning of citizenship, government, and personal rights. In 1765, just 1 year after the Sugar Act, Britain introduced a new law that created even greater controversy. It was called the Stamp Act. Unlike previous taxes that focused mostly on imported goods, the Stamp Act reached directly into the everyday lives of colonial residents. It required many printed materials to carry an official stamp showing that a tax had been paid. The law affected items that people used regularly. Newspapers needed stamped paper. Legal documents required stamps. Business contracts, licenses, pamphlets, and even playing cards were included. Almost every piece of printed material used in colonial society could potentially be affected. To British officials, the Stamp Act was a reasonable way to raise money from the colonies. It was a direct tax designed to help pay for the costs of defending the empire. But to many colonists, the law felt like something entirely different. It was a direct reminder that decisions about their lives were being made by people an ocean away. The reaction throughout the colonies was immediate. In Boston, where political discussion was already growing, anger spread quickly. Newspapers published arguments against the act. Public meetings became places where people debated the future of colonial rights. Could Parliament truly tax them without their permission? Did colonial assemblies have the same rights as Parliament when it came to local matters? One group that became especially important during this period was the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty was a loosely organized group of colonial activists who opposed British taxation and policies. They were not a formal army or government organization. Instead, they were a network of people who used speeches, newspapers, protests, and public demonstrations to express their views. In Boston, one of the most recognizable figures associated with colonial resistance was Samuel Adams. Adams was a writer, political organizer, and passionate defender of colonial rights. He believed that government should respect the liberties of its people, and he used his influence to encourage opposition to British policies. The Sons of Liberty helped organize public protests throughout Boston. One of their most powerful tools was symbolism. In the 1700s, public demonstrations carried great meaning. A gathering in a town square, the hanging of an image representing an unpopular official, or the ringing of church bells could send a message to an entire community. The goal was often not violence, but visibility. As tensions grew, protests became more dramatic. In August 1765, a crowd in Boston gathered after learning that Andrew Oliver, a local official responsible for enforcing the Stamp Act, had been appointed. Protesters built an image representing Oliver and displayed it publicly before destroying it. Later that evening, a crowd gathered outside Oliver's home. The protest showed how quickly frustration could spread. Many people believed they were defending their rights, while British officials viewed these actions as dangerous challenges to authority. The situation became even more intense when the home of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson was attacked. Hutchinson was a respected Massachusetts official who opposed resistance movements. A large crowd broke into his home and destroyed much of his property. The destruction shocked many people, including some who opposed the Stamp Act. The event revealed an important tension within the resistance movement. Many colonists believed in protesting unfair laws, but they disagreed about where the limits of protest should be. Some wanted peaceful political action. Others believed stronger demonstrations were necessary. Across the colonies, resistance continued to grow. Merchants organized boycotts against British goods. Colonial leaders sent petitions to Britain. Representatives from several colonies gathered for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress in New York in 1765. This meeting was significant because it brought together representatives from different colonies to discuss a shared concern. They did not yet see themselves as a separate nation. They still considered themselves British citizens. But for the first time, many colonial leaders were working together to challenge decisions made by the British government. The resistance movement was becoming more organized. Meanwhile, the Stamp Act created practical problems for British officials. Many colonial stamp distributors resigned because they feared public anger. Enforcing the law became increasingly difficult. Eventually, the pressure became too great. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Many colonists celebrated the repeal. In Boston, church bells rang and celebrations took place throughout the city. For a brief moment, it seemed that the conflict had been resolved. But the situation was more complicated. Although Parliament removed the Stamp Act, it also passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had the authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. To British leaders, this simply confirmed their authority. To many colonists, it was a warning. The disagreement had not disappeared. It had only changed form. The Stamp Act crisis was a turning point because it transformed colonial frustration into organized resistance. People who had once accepted British authority without question were now actively discussing the limits of government power. In Boston, the streets looked the same as they always had. Ships continued arriving in the harbor. Merchants continued their work. Families continued their daily routines. But something had changed. The people of the city had discovered that they could unite around a common cause. They had learned the power of public opinion, organized protest, and shared action. The Stamp Act was gone, but the ideas it had created would remain. And in the years ahead, Britain and the colonies would face even more disagreements, each one adding another layer of tension. The quiet harbor city of Boston was slowly becoming the center of a growing struggle over authority, freedom, and the future of the colonies. After the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766, many people in the American colonies hoped that the disagreement with Britain had finally come to an end. For a brief moment, there was a feeling of relief. Merchants returned to their businesses. Newspapers became quieter. Public gatherings became less tense. Many colonists believed that Britain had listened to their concerns, and that the relationship between the colonies and the empire could return to the way it had been before. But beneath the surface, the fundamental disagreement remained. Britain still believed Parliament had the authority to govern the colonies and collect revenue from them. Many colonists still believed that taxes imposed without their consent violated their rights. The conflict had not disappeared. It was only waiting for another spark. That spark came in 1767 with a new series of laws known as the Townshend Acts. Named after Charles Townshend, the British official who helped create them, these laws placed new taxes on imported goods entering the American colonies. The taxes applied to items such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Tea, in particular, would become the most famous of these products. At the time, tea was not simply an ordinary drink. In colonial society, tea was a symbol of comfort, hospitality, and connection to British culture. For many colonists, tea was part of everyday life. That made the tax on tea especially significant. The British government viewed the Townshend Acts as a practical solution. Unlike the Stamp Act, which created a direct tax on colonial residents, these new taxes were placed on imported goods. British leaders believed this would make them more acceptable. They were mistaken. Many colonists argued that the difference between direct and indirect taxes did not matter. Whether a tax was placed on a document or a shipment of tea, they believed the central issue was the same. Britain was collecting money from people who had no representatives in Parliament. The phrase "taxation without representation" continued to spread. In Boston, resistance quickly returned. Newspapers published essays criticizing British policies. Community leaders encouraged colonists to reduce their dependence on imported British goods. Boycotts became one of the most powerful tools of resistance. Instead of simply protesting through speeches and meetings, colonists began changing their everyday habits. Some families avoided purchasing British clothing. Others stopped buying imported products whenever possible. These choices became political statements. Everyday activities, such as what someone wore or what someone drank, became connected to larger debates about freedom and government power. In Boston, the movement against British policies grew stronger. The city had always been a place where people discussed ideas openly. Its printers spread political arguments throughout the region. Its taverns provided places where neighbors gathered to debate the issues of the day. But as resistance grew, British officials became increasingly concerned. They believed that Boston was becoming a center of rebellion. To maintain order and enforce British authority, the government decided to send additional troops to the city. In 1768, British soldiers arrived in Boston. Their presence changed the atmosphere of the city. Before the troops arrived, Boston streets had been filled mostly with merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and families going about their daily lives. Now, soldiers in red uniforms walked through the same streets where political arguments had taken place. To British officials, the soldiers were there to protect government buildings and support the enforcement of laws. To many colonists, their presence felt like intimidation. The sight of armed soldiers stationed among civilians created an uneasy feeling. Many residents wondered why troops were needed in a city that had not been attacked. The relationship between soldiers and citizens grew tense. The British military presence also affected daily life. Soldiers needed housing, supplies, and places to spend their time. Many colonists felt that the government was treating them like a conquered people rather than loyal citizens. Small disagreements became more common. A rude comment in the street, a confrontation near a tavern, or an argument between workers and soldiers could quickly attract a crowd. The city was becoming a place where tensions were always close to the surface. Yet despite the growing anger, not everyone in Boston supported resistance. Some colonists remained loyal to Britain and believed that protests were becoming too extreme. Loyalists argued that the empire provided security and economic opportunities, and they worried that challenging British authority could lead to chaos. Boston was becoming divided. Neighbors, friends, and even families sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. Some believed they were defending their rights. Others believed they were defending stability. Meanwhile, British leaders continued to insist that Parliament had the authority to govern the colonies. They believed resistance movements encouraged disorder and threatened the unity of the empire. The Townshend Acts became another example of how Britain and the colonies viewed the same situation in completely different ways. From Britain's perspective, the empire was asking for cooperation and financial support. From the perspective of many colonists, the empire was taking away freedoms they had always expected to enjoy. Eventually, the pressure began to build. Colonial boycotts hurt British merchants, and opposition to the Townshend Acts continued. In response, Britain eventually repealed most of the taxes in 1770. But one important tax remained. The tax on tea was kept. British leaders wanted to maintain the principle that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. Even though the other taxes disappeared, tea remained a reminder of the larger disagreement. For Boston, this small remaining tax would become extremely important. The city's harbour continued to shine beneath the evening sky. Ships continued arriving with their cargo. Merchants continued working along the waterfront. But the relationship between Britain and Boston had changed forever. The arrival of British soldiers, the spread of protests, and the arguments over taxation had transformed an old disagreement into a much deeper conflict. The city was no longer simply debating taxes. It was debating power. And soon, one violent night in Boston would push tensions even further. By the beginning of 1770, Boston had become a city filled with uncertainty. The streets looked much as they always had. Merchants opened their shops each morning. Ships continued arriving at the harbour. Families gathered around warm fireplaces during the long New England winter. But beneath the familiar routines of daily life, tension had been growing for years. The disagreements over taxation, trade, and British authority had changed the way many colonists viewed their relationship with the empire. What had once been a distant political debate was now visible in the streets of Boston itself. British soldiers stood among the people they were supposed to protect. Their red uniforms were a constant reminder of the conflict between colonial resistance and British control. The presence of troops had begun in 1768, when Britain sent soldiers to Boston after protests against the Townshend Acts. British officials believed the troops were necessary to maintain order and enforce the laws of Parliament. Many residents of Boston saw things differently. To them, a military presence in their city felt like a threat. The relationship between soldiers and civilians became increasingly uncomfortable. Soldiers and workers competed for jobs. Insults were exchanged in the streets. Small disagreements sometimes attracted crowds of curious onlookers. Boston was a crowded city, and rumors traveled quickly. A simple argument could become the subject of conversation throughout the entire community. The winter of 1770 was especially tense. It was an atmosphere that a confrontation would take place. The location was King Street, a busy area near the center of Boston. Here stood the Custom House, where British officials collected taxes and managed trade. For years, the building had represented British authority in the city. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a crowd began gathering outside the Custom House. The exact details of what happened that night have been debated ever since. Different witnesses remembered events differently, and emotions were already running high on both sides. What is known is that a group of colonists began confronting British soldiers stationed outside the building. The crowd grew larger. People shouted at the soldiers. Snowballs and pieces of ice were thrown. Some protesters carried sticks or clubs. The soldiers faced an increasingly hostile crowd. At the center of the tension was a British soldier named Private Hugh Montgomery, along with Captain Thomas Preston, who commanded the soldiers at the scene. The soldiers were surrounded. The crowd continued to grow. In the confusion and fear of the moment, shots were fired. The sound of gunfire echoed through the cold streets of Boston. When the smoke cleared, several colonists lay wounded. 5 men would eventually die as a result of the shooting. The event shocked Boston. Within hours, the confrontation became one of the most discussed events in the colonies. News spread quickly through newspapers, letters, and conversations. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. The name itself reflected the way many colonists viewed what had happened. To many patriots, the shooting represented British oppression and the danger of allowing soldiers to occupy colonial cities. It became a powerful example of why they believed British authority had gone too far. But British officials and loyalists viewed the event differently. They argued that the soldiers had been surrounded by an angry crowd and were acting in self-defense. They believed the troops were being blamed for a dangerous situation they had not created. The truth was more complicated than either side's simple explanation. The confrontation was the result of years of growing mistrust, political disagreements, and tension between soldiers and civilians. But the way people remembered the event became just as important as the event itself. One of the most influential responses came through images and printed materials. Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith and political activist, created an engraving depicting the event. The image showed British soldiers firing in an organized line toward peaceful colonists. Although the engraving was not a perfect representation of everything that happened that night, it was extremely powerful. It spread throughout the colonies and shaped public opinion. Images and stories helped transform the Boston Massacre into a symbol. For many colonists, it represented the dangers of unchecked government power. It became a reminder that they believed their rights needed to be defended. However, there was also an important moment of fairness following the event. Despite the anger surrounding the shooting, the British soldiers involved were given a trial. John Adams, a Boston lawyer who would later become a leader of the new United States, agreed to defend the soldiers in court. Adams believed that everyone deserved a fair trial, even people accused of unpopular actions. The trial revealed the complexity of the situation. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. The defense argued that the soldiers feared for their lives. The prosecution argued that the soldiers had used unnecessary force. In the end, Captain Preston was found not guilty, and several soldiers were acquitted. 2 soldiers were convicted of manslaughter but received reduced punishment. For many colonists, the legal outcome did not erase their anger. The Boston Massacre remained a powerful symbol of conflict between Britain and the colonies. For British officials, however, the event showed the dangers of keeping troops stationed in a city filled with political unrest. Shortly afterward, most British troops were removed from Boston. The immediate crisis had passed. But the memory remained. The Boston Massacre did not cause the American Revolution by itself. The disagreements over taxes and government authority were still unresolved. However, it deepened the mistrust between Britain and many colonists. It showed how quickly political disagreements could become personal. It showed how a single night could change public opinion. And it showed how powerful stories and images could become in shaping history. As Boston returned to its daily routines, the harbor continued to rise and fall with the tides. Merchants returned to their work. Families continued their lives. But the city had changed. The events of that cold March night would not be forgotten. They would remain part of the growing story that would eventually lead Boston toward the most famous act of protest in its history. In the years before the Boston Tea Party, tea was much more than a simple beverage. Today, tea may seem like an ordinary drink enjoyed at any time of day. But in the 18th century, tea represented something much larger. It was connected to social traditions, family gatherings, trade networks, and the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. A small cup of tea carried with it the story of a global empire. To understand why tea became the center of a political crisis, it is important to understand how deeply it was woven into everyday colonial life. In the 1700s, tea was one of the most popular drinks in the British world. The tradition of drinking tea had grown in Britain during the previous century, especially among wealthy households. Over time, it spread throughout society and became a common part of daily routines. In colonial America, tea was enjoyed by many different groups of people. A wealthy merchant's family might serve tea from delicate porcelain cups during an afternoon gathering. A shopkeeper might offer tea to visitors while discussing business. Families might prepare tea in their homes while sharing stories at the end of a long day. The act of drinking tea was often about connection. It provided a reason for people to gather together, exchange news, and maintain relationships. In colonial homes, tea preparation could be a carefully practiced ritual. Special tea sets were brought out for guests. Water was heated over a fire or stove, and the tea leaves were carefully measured before being steeped. The small details mattered. The type of cup, the quality of the tea, and the way it was served could communicate a person's wealth, hospitality, and social standing. But behind these peaceful moments was a complex global system of trade. Tea did not grow in North America. It traveled thousands of miles across oceans before reaching colonial households. Much of the tea consumed in the British Empire came from China. British merchants worked through the powerful East India Company, a corporation that controlled much of the trade between Britain and Asia. The journey from China to America was long and dangerous. Ships carried tea across enormous distances, traveling through changing weather and unpredictable seas. Once the tea reached Britain, it was distributed throughout the empire, including the American colonies. By the middle of the 1700s, tea had become a major part of colonial commerce. Boston's harbor played an important role in this trade network. The city was one of the busiest ports in British North America. Ships arrived carrying goods from across the world, and merchants built their businesses around importing and selling products. Tea was among the most valuable goods moving through the harbor. However, the tea trade was not always simple. Because Britain controlled trade within the empire, colonial merchants had to follow British laws regulating imports and exports. These rules were designed to benefit British businesses and ensure that valuable goods flowed through British channels. Many colonists accepted these restrictions for years, but some merchants found ways around them. Smuggling became common in parts of the colonies, including New England. Some merchants secretly imported goods without paying British taxes or avoiding certain regulations. To British officials, smuggling was illegal and harmful to the empire. To some colonists, it was a response to unfair restrictions. This disagreement became especially important when it came to tea. After the Townshend Acts were passed, many colonists organized boycotts against British goods. They encouraged people to avoid purchasing taxed products as a way of protesting British policies. Tea became a symbol of this resistance. For some colonists, drinking imported British tea meant supporting a government they believed was violating their rights. For others, refusing tea seemed unnecessary or extreme. This created difficult choices in everyday life. A person's decision about what to drink could suddenly become a political statement. Families debated whether they should continue buying tea. Merchants considered whether they should continue importing it. Communities discussed what actions were appropriate and what actions went too far. Women played an especially important role in these decisions. In colonial households, women were often responsible for purchasing household goods and preparing food and beverages. As a result, choices made inside homes became part of the larger political movement. Some women participated in efforts to produce homemade goods instead of purchasing British imports. These efforts showed that resistance was not limited to politicians or wealthy merchants. Ordinary people could participate through their daily choices. Still, not everyone agreed with the growing opposition movement. Many colonists continued drinking tea and believed that political disagreements should be handled through discussion and legal channels. Loyalists, who remained supportive of Britain, argued that rejecting British goods harmed local economies and created unnecessary conflict. The debate over tea reflected a larger disagreement about identity. Were the colonists still simply British citizens living across the ocean? Or had they developed their own distinct society with their own rights and interests? By the early 1770s, these questions had become increasingly difficult to avoid. Tea sat at the center of this debate because it connected everything together. It represented the power of global trade. It represented British influence. It represented colonial wealth and social customs. And increasingly, it represented the question of who had the right to make decisions for the people living in America. In Boston, these discussions continued in homes, shops, meeting houses, and taverns. The city's harbor remained busy. Ships continued arriving with goods from distant lands. Merchants continued making deals along the waterfront. But the meaning of tea had changed. A simple cup that once represented hospitality and comfort now carried political weight. The people of Boston were beginning to understand that everyday actions could become acts of resistance. And soon, Britain would make a decision that would place even more importance on this humble product. A new law would attempt to solve Britain's financial problems while strengthening control over the colonial tea trade. Instead, it would push Boston closer than ever toward confrontation. The stage was being prepared, and at the center of it all was tea. By the early 1770s, the disagreements between Britain and its American colonies had entered a new stage. The arguments over taxation had not disappeared. The memory of the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, and the Boston Massacre still influenced the way many colonists viewed British authority. For years, Britain had tried different ways to strengthen its control over the colonies and increase revenue. Each attempt had created new resistance. But in 1773, British leaders introduced a law they believed would solve several problems at once. This law was called the Tea Act. To British officials, the Tea Act was not intended to create a crisis. In fact, many believed it would make tea cheaper for American consumers while helping an important British company survive. But to many colonists, the law represented something much more concerning. It was another example of Britain attempting to exercise authority over the colonies without their consent. To understand why the Tea Act caused such a strong reaction, it is necessary to understand the situation facing Britain's East India Company. The East India Company was one of the most powerful corporations in the world during the 18th century. It controlled much of Britain's trade with Asia, especially the valuable tea trade with China. For decades, the company had brought enormous amounts of tea into the British Empire. But by the early 1770s, the company was facing serious financial difficulties. Large amounts of unsold tea were sitting in warehouses in Britain. The company had invested heavily in its trade network, but changing markets and political challenges had left it struggling. British leaders wanted to prevent the company from collapsing. The Tea Act was designed as a solution. Under the new law, The East India Company would be allowed to sell tea directly to the American colonies without going through as many British merchants. This would lower the cost of tea and make it more competitive with illegally imported tea. From the British perspective, this seemed like a reasonable compromise. Colonists would receive cheaper tea. The East India Company would receive financial support. The British government would continue collecting the existing tax on tea. Everyone, British officials believed, would benefit. But many colonists saw the situation differently. The issue was not simply the price of tea. The issue was the principle behind the law. Even though the Tea Act lowered the cost of tea, it maintained the tax created by the Townshend Acts. For many colonists, accepting the cheaper tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them. The argument was not about saving money. It was about authority. Many colonists feared that if they accepted the tea tax, they would be admitting that Britain had the right to create any future taxes or laws it wanted. The Tea Act became a symbol of a much larger concern. Could Britain gradually increase its control over the colonies by introducing small changes one at a time? Would accepting one tax make future resistance more difficult? These questions spread throughout the colonies. In Boston, opposition grew quickly. The city had already developed a strong tradition of political discussion and resistance. Newspapers reported on the Tea Act. Community leaders held meetings. Merchants discussed how they should respond. The Sons of Liberty argued that the Tea Act was dangerous because it gave the East India Company special advantages over colonial merchants. Many merchants were concerned that the company's direct access to the colonial market could hurt their own businesses. The Tea Act threatened not only political beliefs, but also economic interests. Once again, trade and politics became connected. Boston residents began organizing resistance. They encouraged people not to purchase the tea. They warned merchants against accepting shipments. They held public meetings where citizens discussed how they should respond. The issue became a community-wide conversation. At the heart of the debate was the question of cooperation. Would colonists accept the Tea Act because it made tea cheaper? Or would they reject it because they believed accepting it would give Britain greater control? Different people reached different conclusions. Some colonists believed resistance was necessary to protect their rights. Others believed the protests were becoming too aggressive and could damage the relationship with Britain beyond repair. The disagreement reflected a society that was becoming increasingly divided. Patriots who opposed British policies saw themselves as defenders of liberty. Loyalists who supported Britain believed the empire provided stability and protection. Many people found themselves somewhere in between, unsure how events would unfold. Meanwhile, British officials continued preparing to send tea shipments to the colonies. They believed that once the tea arrived, people would recognize the benefits of the Tea Act and accept the new arrangement. But they underestimated how strongly many colonists connected tea with political control. By 1773, tea was no longer just a product. It had become a question about rights, a question about government, a question about whether people living across the Atlantic Ocean could have a say in the laws that governed them. In Boston, that question would soon reach a turning point. Ships carrying East India Company tea would soon enter the harbor, and the city would have to decide what to do. The coming weeks would bring crowded meetings, heated discussions, and one of the most famous acts of protest in history. For now, however, the tea remained safely stored away. The harbor continued its daily rhythm. Ships moved with the tides. Merchants conducted business. Families gathered in their homes. But beneath the calm surface, Boston was preparing for a moment that would change everything. The Tea Act had been designed to strengthen Britain's control. Instead, it would bring the colonies closer together in opposition, and the small leaves that had travelled halfway around the world would soon become the centre of a dramatic confrontation on the shores of Boston Harbor. As the year 1773 unfolded, the disagreement between Britain and the American colonies became increasingly difficult to ignore. For years, colonists had expressed concerns about taxation, trade restrictions, and the growing authority of Parliament. They had written petitions, organized boycotts, and gathered in public meetings to voice their frustrations. But by the time the Tea Act was passed, resistance had become more organized. The people opposing British policies were no longer simply reacting to individual laws. They were building networks, sharing information, and creating a movement that could spread throughout the colonies. At the center of this growing movement were the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were not a formal organization with membership cards, offices, or a single leader. Instead, they were a collection of activists, merchants, craftsmen, and political thinkers who shared a common belief that the colonies needed to defend their rights. They worked through meetings, newspapers, speeches, and public demonstrations. Their goal was to influence public opinion and encourage colonists to resist policies they believed threatened their freedoms. In Boston, the movement became especially powerful. The city had long been a place where political ideas spread quickly. Its busy harbor brought news from across the Atlantic. Its printers produced newspapers and pamphlets that could reach thousands of readers. Its taverns and meeting houses provided places where people could gather and discuss events. Boston was a city where ideas traveled. A conversation held in a small tavern could become a public debate. A newspaper article could inspire a protest. A speech in a crowded meeting house could influence the opinions of an entire community. Among the most important figures connected to the Sons of Liberty was Samuel Adams. Adams was born in Boston and had spent much of his life involved in colonial politics. He was not one of the city's wealthiest merchants, but he had a talent for organizing people and communicating political ideas. He believed strongly that government existed to protect the rights of its people. When Britain passed new laws affecting the colonies, Adams argued that colonists had a responsibility to defend their liberties. Through newspapers, letters, and public speeches, he helped shape the arguments against British policies. Adams and other resistance leaders understood that information was one of their greatest tools. In the 1700s, newspapers played an important role in politics. Without modern forms of communication, printed words were one of the fastest ways to spread ideas. Articles criticizing British policies could be copied, shared, and discussed throughout the colonies. Political writers used powerful language to describe their concerns. They warned that unchecked government power could threaten freedom. They argued that colonial rights needed protection. They encouraged people to pay attention to decisions being made in distant London. The Sons of Liberty also understood the importance of public gatherings. Large meetings showed that resistance was not limited to a few individuals. They demonstrated that entire communities were concerned. In Boston, one of the most important places for these gatherings was the Old South Meeting House. The building was one of the largest gathering spaces in the city. Its tall walls and open interior allowed thousands of people to come together to discuss important issues. Here, residents debated the Tea Act and considered how Boston should respond. The meetings were not always calm. People disagreed about what actions were appropriate. Some wanted stronger resistance. Others worried that protests could lead to violence or permanent damage to the relationship with Britain. Yet these discussions were part of an important change. Ordinary citizens were becoming involved in political decisions. The debate was no longer limited to wealthy officials or government leaders. Shopkeepers, sailors, laborers, and families all became part of the conversation. The Sons of Liberty also worked with other resistance groups throughout the colonies. Letters traveled between communities, connecting people in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and beyond. This communication helped create a sense that the colonies shared common concerns. Although each colony had its own government and traditions, many people were beginning to see that they faced similar challenges. The resistance movement was becoming larger than any single city. However, the actions of the Sons of Liberty were controversial. British officials viewed them as troublemakers who encouraged disobedience. Loyalists believed they were creating unnecessary conflict and damaging the stability of the empire. Even among those who opposed British policies, there were disagreements about how far resistance should go. Some believed peaceful protest was enough. Others believed more dramatic action was needed to send a clear message. This question became especially important when the Tea Act brought ships carrying British tea toward American ports. The Sons of Liberty understood that the arrival of this tea would test the strength of the resistance movement. If colonists accepted the tea, Britain might believe that opposition had weakened. If colonists rejected it, they would be openly challenging British authority. The decision would not be simple. It would require ordinary people to choose between following British law and defending what they believed were their rights. As the months passed, the Sons of Liberty prepared for this moment. They organized meetings. They spread information. They encouraged communities to stand together. Their movement was built not only on anger, but also on a belief that people could influence the direction of their society. The streets of Boston continued to look peaceful. The harbor remained busy with ships arriving and departing. Merchants continued opening their shops each morning. Families continued gathering in their homes as evening candles flickered against wooden walls. But beneath the familiar routines, something new was taking shape. The people of Boston were no longer simply discussing government. They were beginning to challenge it. And soon, a group of determined citizens would face one of the most important decisions in colonial history. 3 ships carrying tea would arrive in Boston Harbor, and the movement built by the Sons of Liberty would be tested. By the autumn of 1773, the people of Boston knew that a decision was approaching. For months, conversations about the Tea Act had filled the city's meeting houses, taverns, and streets. Newspapers carried arguments from both supporters and opponents of British policies. Merchants discussed the possible effects on trade. Families debated whether they should continue purchasing tea. Everyone knew that the arrival of the East India Company's tea shipments would force the issue. The question was no longer simply what people believed. The question was what they were willing to do. Across the Atlantic Ocean, ships carrying tea began their long journey toward the American colonies. The British government expected the Tea Act to work as intended. They believed colonists would appreciate the lower prices and eventually accept the continued authority of Parliament. But in Boston, the response was very different. The city had become the center of colonial resistance, and many residents were determined that the tea would not be unloaded. The first of the tea ships headed toward Boston was the Dartmouth. The ship carried hundreds of chests of tea belonging to the East India Company. Each chest contained tightly packed tea leaves that had traveled thousands of miles from China, across the Atlantic Ocean, and into the waters of Boston Harbor. To the crew aboard the ship, it was valuable cargo. To many people in Boston, it represented something much larger. It represented British authority. When the Dartmouth arrived in November 1773, word spread quickly throughout the city. In colonial Boston, news traveled through familiar channels. Merchants shared information along the waterfront. Messengers carried word through the streets. People gathered in taverns and meeting places to discuss what should happen next. The arrival of the ship created a sense of urgency. Under British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the required taxes paid. If the tea remained on the ship too long, authorities could seize it. If it was unloaded, colonists feared it would be purchased and consumed, weakening their resistance. The situation became a complicated legal and political problem. The Sons of Liberty responded by calling a public meeting at the Old South Meeting House. The building quickly became the center of Boston's growing crisis. The Old South Meeting House was one of the largest gathering places in the city. Its wooden interior had witnessed years of religious services, political discussions, and community meetings. Now, it became the place where thousands of people gathered to decide the fate of the tea. On a cold November day, the streets around the meeting house filled with residents. Merchants left their shops. Workers stepped away from their jobs. Neighbors traveled from nearby towns. Inside, the crowd discussed what should be done. Many people argued that the tea should not be unloaded. They believed accepting it would mean accepting Britain's right to tax them without representation. The meeting was peaceful, but the situation was serious. The people gathered there were making a decision that could have consequences for the entire colony. Eventually, they sent a message to the ship's owner and requested that the tea be returned to Britain. But there was a problem. The ship could not simply leave. British law required the tea to be unloaded and the taxes paid. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, refused to allow the ship to depart without following the law. The conflict had reached a standstill. The tea remained trapped in Boston Harbor. The people of Boston refused to accept it. The governor refused to let it leave. And as the days passed, the situation became more tense. Additional tea ships soon arrived. The Eleanor and the Beaver joined the Dartmouth in the harbor, bringing even more tea that faced the same uncertain future. Now, 3 ships sat waiting. Together, they carried hundreds of chests of tea worth a significant amount of money. The pressure increased. British officials worried about losing control of the situation. Merchants worried about the consequences of refusing British goods. Citizens worried about what would happen if they openly challenged the government. Boston had reached a dangerous moment. Yet despite the tension, the city remained surprisingly organized. The resistance leaders wanted to avoid uncontrolled violence. They did not want random destruction or attacks on individuals. Their goal was to make a political statement. This distinction was important. The movement was not simply an angry crowd. It was a carefully coordinated act of protest. The Sons of Liberty continued holding meetings and communicating with other colonies. They wanted the world to understand why they opposed the tea. They believed the issue was not about the tea itself. It was about the power to decide. The tea represented the larger question of whether Britain could continue governing the colonies without their consent. As December approached, the deadline for unloading the tea grew closer. The ships remained in the harbor, their cargo untouched. Every day brought new conversations. Every night brought more uncertainty. People wondered what would happen if the tea stayed aboard the ships. Would Britain compromise? Would the governor change his decision? Would the people of Boston back down? Or would they take a step that could not be undone? The city waited. The harbor waited. And the tea waited. The answer would come on a cold December evening when thousands of people gathered once again. But this time, they would not gather only to debate. They would gather to act. And the quiet waters of Boston Harbor would soon become the setting for one of the most famous moments in American history. As December 1773 arrived, The people of Boston found themselves facing a decision that had been building for months. The ships were still sitting in the harbor. The tea was still locked away aboard their decks. The British government expected the cargo to be delivered, the taxes to be collected, and the controversy to eventually fade away. But Boston had no intention of simply accepting the situation. For weeks, the city had held meetings, written messages, and debated the proper response to the Tea Act. Thousands of residents had gathered at the Old South Meeting House to discuss what should happen next. They had tried every peaceful method available to them. They had asked the tea ships to leave. They had requested that the tea be returned to Britain. They had attempted to convince officials to allow the ships to depart. But Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused. The law would be followed, he insisted. The tea would be unloaded. The taxes would be paid. And the authority of Britain would be respected. For many in Boston, this was the moment when discussion came to an end. On the evening of December 16, 1773, thousands of people gathered once again at the Old South Meeting House. The atmosphere was different from previous meetings. The crowd knew that the deadline was approaching. If the tea remained in the harbor past the legal limit, British authorities could seize it. If the tea was unloaded, many feared that resistance to the Tea Act would collapse. The meeting house filled with people. Merchants stood beside laborers. Political leaders stood beside ordinary citizens. The room was crowded with voices, questions, and uncertainty. Outside, the streets of Boston were filled with people waiting to hear what would happen. The gathering became one of the largest public meetings in colonial America. Inside the meeting house, the crowd demanded one final answer from Governor Hutchinson. Would he allow the tea ships to leave? The answer was no. Hutchinson had made his decision. The ships would remain in Boston Harbor until the tea was unloaded. The crowd understood what this meant. The final opportunity for compromise had disappeared. A message was delivered to the meeting announcing Hutchinson's refusal. The response from the gathering was not a violent outburst. Instead, a simple phrase was heard. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." With those words, the crowd began leaving the meeting house. But they were not going home. Outside, the evening air was cold. The streets were dark, illuminated only by lanterns and the glow of nearby homes and businesses. A large group began moving through Boston toward Griffin's Wharf, where the tea ships waited. Among them were members of the Sons of Liberty. Some wore disguises, including clothing meant to resemble Mohawk Indians. The reason for the disguises was symbolic as well as practical. The protesters wanted to hide their identities, but the appearance also represented their claim that they were acting as Americans rather than British subjects. The Mohawk image had been used before in colonial resistance movements as a symbol of independence and connection to the land. As the crowd approached the harbor, the ships rested quietly in the darkness. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver waited with their valuable cargo still untouched. The scene must have been strangely quiet. The sounds of the harbor continued around them. The water moved gently against the docks. The wooden ships creaked with the movement of the tide. The city lights reflected across the surface of the water. And then the protesters began their work. They boarded the ships and opened the tea chests. The action was organized and deliberate. They did not attack the crews. They did not steal the tea. They did not damage other cargo. Their purpose was not personal gain. Their purpose was protest. One by one, the tea chests were opened. The contents were lifted and emptied into Boston Harbor. The dark tea leaves spilled into the cold water below. Hundreds of chests were destroyed that night. By the end of the evening, Approximately 342 chests of tea had been thrown into the harbour. The value of the destroyed tea was enormous for the time, but the symbolic value was even greater. The protesters wanted Britain to understand that they would not quietly accept laws they believed violated their rights. The destruction of the tea was a carefully controlled act. Those involved took care to avoid unnecessary damage. They swept the decks afterward and made sure that only the tea itself was destroyed. This detail was important. The protesters wanted their message to be clear. They were not criminals looking for chaos. They believed they were defending their liberties. As quickly as it began, the event ended. The crowds disappeared back into the streets of Boston. The ships remained at the wharf. The harbour grew quiet again. The moon continued to shine over the water, now carrying the remains of the tea that had travelled so far from China. The following morning, Boston looked much the same as it had before. The streets were still there. The shops opened. The harbour continued its daily activity. But something had changed. The world now knew what had happened. The destruction of the tea became one of the boldest acts of resistance against British authority. It showed that many colonists were willing to take serious risks to defend what they believed were their rights. The Boston Tea Party was not the beginning of the conflict between Britain and the colonies. That conflict had been growing for years. But this moment transformed the disagreement into something much larger. British leaders could not ignore what had happened. The government had been directly challenged. A valuable shipment belonging to one of Britain's most important companies had been destroyed. A group of colonists had openly rejected Parliament's authority. The response from Britain would soon be severe. For now, however, Boston returned to the quiet rhythm of life along the harbour. The ships rocked gently in the water. The lanterns flickered in the windows. And beneath the calm surface of the city, history had changed forever. A single December night had turned a political disagreement into a moment remembered around the world. When the sun rose over Boston Harbor on December 17, 1773, the city awoke to a scene that would soon become known far beyond the shores of Massachusetts. The events of the previous night were no longer a private protest. They had become a public statement. The tea ships remained at Griffin's Wharf, but their valuable cargo was gone. The chests that had carried tea across thousands of miles were now empty, and the harbour water held the remains of the shipment that had become the centre of a political struggle. For the people of Boston, the morning after the Tea Party brought a mixture of emotions. Some felt pride. Some felt relief. Others felt uncertainty about what would happen next. The destruction of the tea had been carefully planned, but everyone understood that there would be consequences. Britain was unlikely to ignore such an open challenge to its authority. The people of Boston had made their message clear. Now they had to wait and see how Britain would respond. As news spread throughout the city, conversations filled the streets. Merchants discussed what the event meant for trade. Families debated whether the protest had been necessary. Political leaders considered what actions should come next. The Boston Tea Party had created a moment that could not easily be undone. The protesters had not simply rejected attacks. They had directly challenged the power of Parliament. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the British government would soon hear the news. But before that happened, the story travelled through the colonies. In the 18th century, information moved slowly compared with the modern world, but political news could still spread quickly through letters, newspapers, and word of mouth. Travellers carried stories between towns. Printers published reports. Merchants shared information through their business networks. Within weeks, people throughout the colonies knew what had happened in Boston. The reaction was mixed. Many supporters of colonial resistance celebrated the action. They believed the Boston Tea Party showed courage and determination. To them, the protesters had defended an important principle, that people should have a voice in the laws that governed them. They viewed the destruction of the tea as an act of resistance against unfair authority. For these supporters, Boston had taken a stand not only for Massachusetts, but for all the colonies. The event inspired admiration in many communities. Some colonies sent messages of support to Boston. Others began discussing how they might respond if Britain attempted to punish the city. The idea that the colonies shared common interests grew stronger. However, not everyone approved. Many loyalists were shocked by what had happened. To those who remained supportive of Britain, the destruction of the tea was not an act of liberty. It was an act of lawlessness. They argued that destroying private property was unacceptable, regardless of political disagreements. They believed that the protesters had gone too far and that their actions would only bring harsher punishment from Britain. Even some people who opposed British taxes worried about the consequences. The Tea Party had crossed an important line. Before this moment, many colonists had focused on petitions, boycotts, and peaceful resistance. Now, property belonging to a powerful British company had been deliberately destroyed. The question became whether the protest would encourage Britain to compromise or respond with force. In Boston itself, the identity of the participants remained a mystery. Although many people knew who was involved, the names of most participants were never officially revealed. The disguises worn during the event helped protect their identities. For some, this anonymity became part of the story. The Boston Tea Party was not remembered as the action of one person or one leader. It became a symbol of collective resistance. Hundreds of ordinary people had participated. They were merchants, craftsmen, sailors, laborers, and citizens who believed they were defending their rights. The event demonstrated the power of organized community action. The days following the Tea Party were also filled with practical concerns. The destroyed tea represented a significant financial loss. The East India Company expected compensation. British officials demanded accountability. Colonial leaders wondered how they should respond if Britain attempted to punish the city. For Governor Thomas Hutchinson, the situation was especially difficult. As the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Hutchinson had attempted to enforce British law while maintaining order in the colony. But after the Tea Party, his relationship with many colonists became even more strained. He believed the authority of the government had been directly attacked. To restore order, he believed Britain needed to demonstrate that Parliament's laws could not simply be ignored. In London, British officials viewed the event as a serious challenge. The destruction of the tea was not only a financial loss. It was a symbolic rejection of British control. A group of colonists had shown that they were willing to openly resist imperial authority. The British government now faced a difficult choice. Would it negotiate with the colonies, or would it punish Boston to reassert control? Many officials believed a strong response was necessary. They feared that if Boston's actions went unanswered, other colonies might follow the same path. The news of the Tea Party reached Britain in early 1774. As lawmakers discussed what had happened, anger grew. To many British leaders, Boston had gone too far. They believed the city needed to be taught a lesson. The punishment that followed would become one of the most important turning points on the road to revolution. But before those consequences arrived, Boston had a moment to reflect on what it had done. The city had begun the year debating a tax on tea. It ended the year with one of the most famous acts of protest in history. The harbour was quiet again. The tea leaves had settled beneath the water. The ships continued to move with the tides. But the meaning of that night would continue spreading. The Boston Tea Party had shown that the conflict between Britain and the colonies was no longer only about laws and taxes. It had become a struggle over power, identity, and the future of an entire society. And Britain's answer would soon arrive. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached Britain in early 1774, the reaction among government leaders was one of anger and disbelief. To many officials in London, the events of December 16, 1773, were not simply a protest over tea. They were a direct challenge to British authority. A group of colonists had destroyed valuable property belonging to the East India Company. They had openly refused to obey Parliament's laws. They had shown that British power could be resisted. For years, Britain had attempted to maintain control over the American colonies through taxes, regulations, and enforcement. This time, colonists had crossed a line. British leaders feared that if Boston's actions were ignored, other colonies might become encouraged to challenge British authority as well. The government needed to send a message. The response came in the form of a series of laws passed by Parliament in 1774. In Britain, these laws were officially known as the Coercive Acts. In the American colonies, however, they became known as the Intolerable Acts. They believed these laws were not simply punishments for the Tea Party. They believed they were an attempt to take away their rights and force Massachusetts into submission. The first and most damaging of these laws was the Boston Port Act. This act closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for. For a city that depended heavily on trade, the punishment was devastating. Boston's harbor had always been the center of its economy. Merchants depended on the movement of cargo. Dock workers depended on ships arriving and departing. Closing the harbor threatened nearly every part of daily life. The law meant that ships could no longer legally load or unload goods in Boston. The busy waterfront became quiet. The familiar sounds of merchants conducting business, sailors moving cargo, and ships arriving from distant places began to disappear. For many residents, the punishment felt unfair. The British government was punishing an entire city for the actions of a group of protesters. The second major law changed the structure of Massachusetts' colonial government. Known as the Massachusetts Government Act, it reduced the power of the elected colonial assembly and increased the authority of the royal governor. For generations, colonists had valued their ability to manage many local affairs through their own representatives. The new law threatened that tradition. Many residents believed Britain was removing the very rights they had fought to preserve. Another law, the Administration of Justice Act, affected how British officials could be prosecuted. The Act allowed certain British officials accused of committing crimes while enforcing government policies to be tried in Britain or another location instead of Massachusetts. Supporters of the law argued that officials needed protection from unfair colonial juries. Critics believed it created a system where British officials could avoid responsibility for their actions. The Quartering Act was also expanded. This law allowed British soldiers stationed in the colonies to receive housing and supplies. Although the Act did not specifically force soldiers into private homes without permission in every circumstance, many colonists viewed it as another example of Britain placing military authority above civilian rights. To people in Boston, the message was clear. Britain was increasing control. The government was responding to protest with punishment rather than compromise. Instead of calming the conflict, the Intolerable Acts had the opposite effect. They united many colonists who had previously disagreed about how to respond to Britain. Before the Tea Party, resistance movements were often focused on specific issues. Some people opposed taxes. Others opposed trade restrictions. Some worried about British soldiers. But the Intolerable Acts created a broader concern. If Britain could punish Massachusetts this way, could it do the same to other colonies in the future? Communities throughout the colonies began sending support to Boston. Food, supplies, and messages of encouragement traveled to Massachusetts. Farmers, merchants, and families from other colonies contributed what they could to help the people affected by the closed harbor. The punishment that Britain intended to isolate Boston instead created a stronger sense of unity. The idea that the colonies shared a common struggle became more powerful. Even colonies that had previously been cautious about resistance began reconsidering their position. The actions against Boston felt like a warning to everyone. Meanwhile, life in Boston became increasingly difficult. The closed harbor affected workers and families across the city. Merchants lost income. Laborers lost jobs. Businesses struggled. People who had nothing to do with the Tea Party suffered from the punishment. Yet many residents remained determined. They believed that accepting the punishment without resistance would mean accepting Britain's authority to control their lives without their consent. Public meetings continued. Political discussions increased. The city became even more focused on the question that had been growing for years. What rights did the colonies have? And how far were they willing to go to defend them? For British leaders, the intolerable acts were meant to restore order. They believed that firm action would convince colonists to obey the law and discourage future protests. But they misunderstood the effect the punishment would have. Instead of making Boston surrender, the laws strengthened the resistance movement. The suffering of one city became a concern shared by many colonies. The crisis was no longer limited to Massachusetts. It had become a colonial issue. As the summer of 1774 approached, leaders from across British America began planning a response. They would meet together to discuss the growing conflict and decide what actions should be taken. The First Continental Congress would soon gather in Philadelphia. There, representatives from the colonies would debate their future relationship with Britain. The Boston Tea Party had begun as a protest against a tax on tea. But Britain's response transformed it into something much larger. The struggle was no longer only about tea. It was about representation. It was about government. It was about whether people across an ocean could remain loyal subjects while resisting the authority of the empire that ruled them. And as Boston's harbor sat quiet under British punishment, the colonies moved closer than ever toward revolution. In the months following the passage of the Intolerable Acts, Boston entered one of the most difficult periods in its history. The city that had once been known for its busy harbor, thriving trade, and constant movement became a place of uncertainty. The streets felt different. The people of Boston now lived under the pressure of a punishment designed to force them into obedience. But instead of ending resistance, the Intolerable Acts created a stronger sense of unity among many colonists. The British government had hoped that isolating Boston would discourage further protests. Instead, the suffering of the city became a symbol throughout the colonies. People from other communities saw Boston's punishment as a warning. The crisis in Boston was no longer just a Massachusetts problem. It had become a colonial concern. The Boston Port Act officially closed the harbor in June 1774. For a city built around trade, the consequences were immediate. Ships that once filled the waterfront were unable to conduct normal business. Merchants who depended on imports and exports faced financial losses. Dock workers, sailors, and craftsmen who relied on the movement of goods found themselves without the same opportunities. For generations, Boston's identity had been connected to the sea. The harbor was where fortunes were made, where news arrived from distant lands, and where the city connected with the wider world. Now, that connection had been interrupted. The punishment affected not only wealthy merchants but ordinary families as well. A shopkeeper who depended on imported goods. a sailor who depended on ships arriving, a worker who depended on loading and unloading cargo. All felt the impact. The British government had intended the punishment to target the leaders of resistance, but the reality was much broader. Everyone in Boston was affected. Yet instead of turning against the resistance movement, many residents became even more determined. They believed that accepting the punishment without protest would mean admitting that Britain had the right to control their lives without their consent. Support began arriving from other colonies. Communities sent food, supplies, and messages of encouragement to Boston. Farmers donated goods. Merchants offered assistance. Neighboring colonies organized efforts to support the city. The help was not only practical, it was symbolic. It showed the people of Boston that they were not alone. The colonies were beginning to see themselves as connected by a shared experience. The crisis also changed the way many people thought about their relationship with Britain. For years, some colonists had hoped that disagreements could be resolved through petitions and compromise. They still considered themselves British citizens. They still valued their connection to British culture and traditions. But the intolerable acts caused many to question whether reconciliation was possible. If Britain responded to protest with punishment, what options remained? The answer became increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, British soldiers continued to occupy Boston. The military presence added another layer of tension to daily life. Soldiers walked through streets where residents had lived for generations. They guarded government buildings and enforced British authority. To British officials, the soldiers represented order. To many colonists, they represented control. The relationship between civilians and soldiers remained uneasy. Boston residents remembered the events of 1770, when a confrontation between colonists and British troops had resulted in the deaths of 5 people during the Boston Massacre. Although several years had passed, the memory remained powerful. Many feared that another confrontation could happen. The city became a place where small disagreements carried greater meaning. A conversation between a soldier and a citizen could attract attention. A public gathering could become a political statement. A decision by a government official could create another wave of anger. Every action seemed connected to the larger conflict. Despite the pressure, Boston continued to function. Families still gathered in their homes. Markets still operated. Church bells still rang. Children still played in the streets. Life continued, but with a growing awareness that something important was happening. The ordinary routines of the city now existed alongside an extraordinary political crisis. In response to Britain's actions, colonial leaders began organizing a broader movement. Representatives from 12 colonies prepared to meet in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The purpose of the gathering was to discuss how the colonies should respond to British policies and whether they should work together in opposition. This was a significant moment. For much of colonial history, the colonies had been separate communities with their own governments and traditions. They shared a connection to Britain, but they were not united politically. Now, a common crisis was bringing them together. The people of Boston had become central to this movement. The Tea Party, the closing of the harbor, and the punishment that followed had made Massachusetts the focus of colonial attention. Boston had become both a symbol of resistance and a reminder of the risks involved in challenging British power. As the year continued, tensions grew. British officials believed they were restoring order. Many colonists believed they were defending their rights. Both sides believed they were acting in the name of justice. The possibility of peaceful resolution became more uncertain. The city beside the harbor had changed dramatically in only a few years. It had gone from a prosperous colonial port to the center of a dispute that involved an entire empire. The people walking through Boston streets in 1774 could not know exactly what the future would bring. They did not know that battles would soon be fought. They did not know that independence would eventually be declared. They did not know that their city would become one of the first places where the American Revolution began. They only knew that something had changed. The old relationship between Britain and the colonies was disappearing, and in its place was a new idea, that the people of the colonies could stand together and determine their own future. As Boston endured hardship, the movement against British authority continued to grow. The harbor remained closed. The soldiers remained in the city. The tension remained. And the path ahead was leading toward a moment that would change history forever. On a cold December evening in 1773, a group of ordinary people walked through the streets of Boston toward the water. They carried no weapons. They did not come to fight a battle. They did not come seeking wealth or personal gain. They came carrying a message. In the darkness of the harbor, beneath the glow of lanterns and the quiet movement of the tide, they opened hundreds of wooden chests and emptied their contents into the water below. The tea that had traveled thousands of miles across the ocean was gone. But the meaning of that moment would travel much farther than the tea ever could. The Boston Tea Party was not a single event that appeared out of nowhere. It was the result of years of growing disagreements between Britain and its American colonies. It began with questions about government and authority. It grew through debates about taxes, trade, and representation. It became stronger through protests, newspapers, public meetings, and the voices of people who believed that their rights were being ignored. For many years, the people of Boston had considered themselves loyal members of the British Empire. They traded with Britain. They followed British laws. They shared British traditions. The harbor that surrounded their city connected them to a larger world. Ships carried goods and messages across the Atlantic, creating a relationship that had lasted for generations. But over time, that relationship began to change. The French and Indian War placed new financial pressures on Britain and encouraged the government to seek more control over its colonies. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts introduced new disagreements about taxation and authority. The arrival of British soldiers in Boston created tension between civilians and the military. The Boston Massacre showed how quickly that tension could become dangerous. And the Tea Act transformed a simple product into a symbol of a much larger struggle. Tea was never just about tea. It represented a question that had been growing in the minds of many colonists. Who had the right to make decisions about their lives? The British government believed Parliament had the authority to govern the colonies. Many colonists believed that government authority depended on the consent of the people being governed. Both sides believed they were defending their own principles. That was what made the conflict so difficult. It was not simply a disagreement between good and bad people. It was a clash between two different ideas about power, loyalty, and the relationship between a government and its citizens. The men and women who participated in resistance movements did not know they were creating the beginning of a revolution. Most were not thinking about creating a new nation. They were thinking about the issues directly in front of them. They were thinking about their communities, their families, their businesses, their rights. The people who gathered in Boston's meeting houses and walked toward Griffin's Wharf were ordinary individuals living through an extraordinary moment. Some were merchants. Some were craftsmen. Some were sailors. Some were workers whose names would never appear in history books. But together, they created an event that would be remembered for centuries. The Boston Tea Party also reminds us that history is often shaped by small moments. A law passed in a distant capital. a conversation in a crowded tavern, a meeting in a wooden hall, a decision made on a quiet evening, each moment built upon the one before it. The Tea Party itself did not immediately create American independence. The revolution would not begin for several more months. The colonies and Britain would continue moving toward conflict. The intolerable acts would punish Boston. The First Continental Congress would gather. Battles would eventually break out. A new nation would later be formed. But the Boston Tea Party was a turning point. It showed that many colonists were willing to take bold action. It showed that resistance had moved beyond words. And it showed Britain that the relationship between the empire and its colonies had fundamentally changed. Today, Boston Harbor is peaceful. The ships that once carried tea and other goods have been replaced by modern vessels. The streets that once echoed with colonial voices now welcome visitors from around the world. The city has grown and changed, but reminders of the past remain. The meeting houses, waterfront, and historic locations connected to the Tea Party continue to tell the story of a moment when ordinary people challenged a powerful empire. Standing beside the harbor today, it can be difficult to imagine the uncertainty of that winter night. The darkness, the cold air, the sound of footsteps moving through the streets, the quiet movement of ships resting in the water, the feeling that something important was about to happen. The people of Boston could not see the future. They did not know exactly where their actions would lead. They only knew that they had reached a moment when they needed to choose. And they chose to act. The tea leaves that fell into Boston Harbor eventually disappeared beneath the waves. The wooden ships eventually sailed away. The voices of the people who participated eventually faded. But the idea behind that night remained. The idea that ordinary people could question authority. The idea that communities could organize around shared beliefs. The idea that decisions affecting people's lives should involve the people themselves. That was the true legacy of the Boston Tea Party. Not the destruction of tea. Not the ships. Not the harbor. But the message carried beyond that December night. A message about representation. A message about rights. A message about the power of people coming together. And as the evening settles over Boston Harbor once again, the water grows quiet. The lights of the city reflect across the surface. The tide rises and falls as it has for centuries. And beneath the calm waters, beneath the modern city, beneath the layers of time, remains the memory of a night when a small group of people changed the course of history. Good night.